All right, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great honor to be here. I think it's fair to say it's a little unexpected to see a DeFi conference organized by the Swiss National Bank and the BIS. But I think it's extremely important. It's an important exchange, and I think the organizers did a fantastic job putting together a program and also inviting people from traditional finance, from central banks, obviously, but also from the crypto space. And this conversation is extremely important to have. Now, my job right now is to set the stage with a definition, with what we're actually talking about, because a severe risk, I'm somewhat afraid, is that we have a different language in these two different areas, and that we might think that we agree on things we actually don't, and otherwise that we might think we disagree on things we actually do agree on. So let me get started with a simple definition. What is DeFi? And I have to say that's my definition. When you ask different people, then you might get something completely different. But there is no clear consensus on what it is, but I think it's not the most controversial one. So decentralized finance, or DeFi, employs public blockchain networks and smart contracts to build open, transparent, composable, and non-custodial financial protocols. Now, when you look at these words, open, what does it mean? Open means anyone can join. You don't have any restrictions. You don't have to ask anyone for permission. You can just join that network by default. What does transparent mean? Transparent means it's mathematically verifiable. You don't have to trust anyone. When something happens on that blockchain, you can verify if the execution actually is in accordance with the consensus protocol and with the contracts. And you yourself, you can do that. And also the data is available. It's not in silos. It's not on a multitude of core banking systems. It is available in the public domain, and that's really exciting. It has its pros and cons, of course, but it's exciting. And composability, that's something I'm going to talk a lot about in that talk. You can think of it a little bit as interoperable Lego pieces. So you have money Legos, you have individual protocols, and when you have a protocol, then something that's newly created, so a different protocol, can just make use of the first one. No worries, I will have some examples in the talk, but that's something that is extremely exciting about DeFi. And last but not least, non-custodial. You don't have to trust anyone else with your assets, with your money. You hold your private keys, you can access these protocols without going through an intermediary, you can access them directly. Now, a while ago I've published a paper with the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, where I've proposed a model how you can think about DeFi. So what are the different layers? And we will go through these layers one by one. So you have the settlement layer, which essentially is the blockchain. Then you have the asset layer, where the different assets are created. In a blockchain context, these assets usually are referred to as tokens. Then you have the protocol layer, where you have things like exchanges, lending protocols, derivative protocols, asset management protocols. So pretty much anything you can think of in a traditional finance context can be recreated on the public blockchain, can be recreated in DeFi. And then you have two more things, the application layer and aggregation layer. You could also summarize the two of them by calling them access layer. That's essentially what it is. It's the idea how people are going to access these smart contracts. So we can think of a front end. Now let's get started with the settlement layer. The settlement layer essentially is just a blockchain. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk for a long time about blockchain. I assume most of you are familiar with that. But there are some things which are extremely important, and there might be some misunderstandings already on the term blockchain. What do we need to have a blockchain? Well, first of all, we need a peer-to-peer network. We need some way of exchanging information. Information, usually transactions and blocks, which are just collections of transactions. And ideally, you can just join that network. Again, you don't have to ask anyone for permission. What else do you need? Well, you need some way of telling whether a transaction came actually from the person who it is claiming it came from, and also hasn't it been manipulated along the way. So transaction authenticity and integrity. And it is usually achieved through public key cryptography. And then last but not least, you need a consensus protocol. It doesn't really help when everyone has his own database and there is no agreement on that. Everyone is just having their own instance. So you need some way of reaching an agreement. And that's referred to as a consensus protocol. And of course, there are more centralized ones and more decentralized ones. But the goal is, again, that there are no special privileges so that we don't have a boss. what you see here is extremely important. And also this may part right here, that's probably the most important word right here. Depending on the exact specification and architecture of the blockchain, it may create something that's decentralized, open, transparent, and immutable. When you have a peer-to-peer network where you have some restrictions on who can join, for example, then of course you have someone with special privileges. When you have a consensus protocol where one person or one entity is the boss, and obviously it's not immutable because they can change it. So when we talk about DeFi today, then we're really talking about a public network, an open network, a decentralized network, and I think that's really important, okay? Now, what people usually have in mind when they talk about the blockchain transaction is a transaction in cryptocurrency, so from Alice to Bob. And that is already exciting because, again, it's self-custodial. They don't have to ask anyone for permission. But that's the most trivial case and certainly not what we're here for. With DeFi, you can do a lot more than just a simple transaction of a cryptocurrency. But to understand that, we have to understand smart contracts. Because whatever we do later on is based on these contracts. Now, a smart contract is actually a misnomer, has nothing to do with contracts, has nothing to do with being smart. What it is, it's just code on the blockchain, code that's running there on an account. And the code is immutably stored on the blockchain, it's publicly observable, so you know what you're getting into. The execution is verifiable, and state changes, so when something happens, that's actually stored on the blockchain again. And most importantly, in the context of DeFi, these smart contracts, they can control assets, so they can lock up assets. And when you have assets on a smart contract, then they are subject to the rules of that smart contract. Now, there are two slides which are a little more technical, but I think it's extremely important to understand that. That's why I'm specifically talking about this. A smart contract has two integral parts. Number one, it's functions. It's do something. So you can send a transaction to that smart contract, you can call it. And then you have state variables, and that's basically the storage of that smart contract. And you will see an example when we talk about tokens, what exactly I mean. And that's where we're going now, to the asset layer, so how we can actually create tokens. I think everyone in here knows what tokens are on a very high level, right? I mean, when we talk about tokens, then we talk about the representation of an asset on a blockchain. What people usually have in mind is real estate, paintings, maybe stable coins. But the first thing that's important is to differentiate between off-chain promises, where you obviously have a counterparty risk, because somebody is promising you to deliver something, and the blockchain cannot enforce that. When I promise you to deliver an ounce of gold, it's subject to my reputation. And something that happens on-chain, so an on-chain utility. And much of what we're talking about today is actually an on-chain utility, so things like governance tokens. Now, a little more technically, what is a token? A token itself already is a smart contract. It has functions, and it has a storage, some variables. And even if you have no experience whatsoever with these tokens, pay attention. It's not that hard. It's super simple, actually. The first function you have is a transfer function. So let's say, again, Alice is calling that function. Then she's sending a transaction to the smart contract. She specifies a to address. So, for example, Bob, and an amount. And then she's calling that smart contract. And in the smart contract, you can think of it a little bit as a spreadsheet. You have all of these different ownerships. It's an ownership table, essentially. So what would happen is, when you call that smart contract and say, Alice to Bob, amount 3, then this ownership table, these balances would get updated accordingly. Okay? And the second thing you have to know is this combination of approve and transfer from. And you can think of it a little bit like direct debit. It's really just direct debit. That's what it is in a traditional sense. Okay? You give somebody else approval to withdraw assets from your account. And that's super important in the context of smart contracts. So when you call transfer from, you say from to amount. And of course, you need to have the permission. And the permission is called with approve. So you set a spender, you set an amount, and it's stored in yet another table, also on that smart contract, the allowances table. So for example, this row right here means Alice gave the approval to Bob to spend 5 of these tokens. Okay? And that's all you need to know about tokens. That's really it. That's the standard. Now, why a standard? Well, you could implement these tokens in any way, really. But if you want to make use of them in a DeFi environment, then they are better standardized. Because otherwise, a decentralized exchange, for example, would have to treat each and every token individually, which would probably not be a good idea. And it's one of the problems we currently have with core banking systems. So let me give you an example with a conditional token transaction. You again have Alice and Bob. Alice currently owns a red token. Bob currently owns a blue token. They'd like to exchange these two tokens, okay? And of course, you could say Alice is going to move the red token first, and then later on Bob is going to move the blue token, but that would require trust. One of the really exciting things you can do in a blockchain setup is make these two steps inseparable in a so-called atomic transaction. So you know for sure that they both happen together, or none of them happen. None of this happens at all. And that is a basic building block. That's called atomicity, and you will see later on when we go into so-called composability. So when we add things, this is really important that it's part just of one transaction, where you can effectively get rid of this specific counterparty risk. Now let's go into the protocol layer. And again, it's about exchanges, lending protocols, and so on. But I want to start with something extremely simple. And this really simple thing is just a token basket. Our goal right now is to create a simple protocol, again, smart contract-based, that emulates a mutual fund with a 50-50 allocation in red and blue tokens and mints a new token, a yellow one, that is redeemable and represents partial ownership in that basket. Okay? So you have Alice. Alice currently owns a red and a blue token. And then you have a smart contract here, a new one, which is a token basket. And what happens right now is that Alice would call that contract, this token basket. The token basket would pull these tokens from Alice's account, so the red and the blue token, and would mint a yellow token, which is redeemable for the proportional allocation of Alice. That's the idea. That by itself is not that special. But again, what's special about it is that this is a single transaction. You have no risk whatsoever involved. That's composability. This happens in one transaction. Of course, it's several steps. Or when one step fails, the entire transaction will fail. And since we're talking about a smart contract where you can look at the code in advance, you know exactly what's supposed to happen. And that is extremely exciting. Now, let's actually build on that example. What if Alice doesn't own a red and a blue token to begin with? What if Bob owns two red tokens initially? What would happen? Well, you could say maybe Bob is going to a decentralized exchange. And of course, you could have a separate transaction where Bob exchanges one red token for a blue token. But what you could also do is set this smart contract up in a way that already in the smart contract, when the smart contract receives two red tokens, it is making use of the decentralized exchange. And it gets back a blue token. And then again, we have the blue and the red token in this token basket, and they can mint the yellow basket token that can later on be redeemed for these two assets. What is exciting? Well, again, it's one transaction. Everything you see here, it is a single transaction. It's atomic. You cannot separate it. And that is extremely exciting. Now, how do these decentralized exchanges work? There is a large variety of different setups, but probably the most relevant one is a simple XYK, constant product function design. And you can think of it a little bit as this is the current holdings of the smart contract of the decentralized exchange in X tokens and in Y tokens. And when you multiply the two, so the product always has to be equal to a constant K, okay? So you end up with this convex curve right here. And then when somebody swaps tokens, then what happens? Well, this person would add X tokens to the smart contract, to the decentralized exchange, and would get Y tokens in exchange, get them paid out. That's the entire setup. This happens automatically. It's an endogenous price-finding mechanism, and due to arbitrage, this should be in line with the other exchanges, so more centralized ones. Now, people can actually provide liquidity. That's the other part. It's not that there's just some tokens magically on there, but anyone can provide liquidity to that decentralized exchange. Anyone can add X and Y tokens in the same proportion and become a liquidity provider. And the question is, why would they do that? And there is one simple answer. Of course, there's a fee involved. When somebody swaps with the smart contract, with this exchange, then there is a fee accumulation, and people will get a proportion of that fee when they are holding these liquidity provision tokens. Okay? So what do you end up with? A completely decentralized exchange with no dependencies whatsoever, with an endogenous pricing mechanism, just a smart contract that creates billions of US dollars daily just with infrastructure. No employees, no way to stop it, no special privileges, and that is extremely exciting. Now, let me actually add on that example. Remember, we had the token basket, we had the decentralized exchange, but that by itself is, well, you need some form to generate a yield in a mutual fund, right? So what could you do? Well, the token basket, who currently holds this red and blue token, could actually invest that in a decentralized lending platform. So we have a decentralized lending platform here with over-collateralized loans. The token basket could add some tokens to that lending platform and receive liquidity provision tokens, where it would get a yield. And as you probably have guessed already, yes, it's still one single transaction. It's still just Bob calling that initial token basket, and everything is one inseparable transaction, where you have no counterparty risk whatsoever. Now, the last thing is the application and aggregation layer. And to be honest, that's probably the least exciting part. That's just the user interface, if you want to call it that way, okay? So, of course, anyone can just connect with the smart contracts themselves. You don't need any additional browser-based interface or anything like that, but most people will not do so. Most people, they like it when it's in their browser, they like a Web3 interface, they like just when they can use it similarly to the existing banking services. And that's why you have these front ends on the application layer, and also when there are multiple applications mixed up together, the aggregation layer. That's probably one of the most centralized parts right here. That's also where a lot of financial institutions are interested in, that they can offer these services as a bridge to DeFi. Now, let me come to the, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to do that, I'm just doing it, to the question of the conference already. Which is, as a quick reminder, does safe DeFi require CBDC? And I have a pretty clear opinion on that. And I'm looking forward to the discussions later on, but my opinion is no, absolutely not. If you read the question again, does safe DeFi require CBDC? What does it mean? It's like saying, does safe decentralization need centralization? Right? And when we take DeFi as being really decentralized, and certainly it's a no. But again, not sure if I'm allowed to do that, but I'm doing it. Let me propose a different question. Could a CBDC in a DeFi ecosystem be mutually beneficial? Because I think that's a much more interesting question, to be honest. Right? Are there benefits? And when you look at DeFi, I think it's a maybe, because certainly, even though there is room for completely decentralized protocols, when you look at the current state of DeFi, there are many more centralized protocols, right? And things like heavily centralized stablecoins, off-chain collateralized stablecoins. And when you have an off-chain collateralized stablecoin where some entity promises you to deliver USD, then a CBDC is just strictly better than that. In most of these centralized stablecoins, you also have backdoors in there. You also have functions where you can blacklist, whitelist, where you can move funds even if you don't have the private key. We probably would see that in a CBDC as well, but that's not different, right? It's the exact same thing. But you get rid of one risk, the counterparty risk. And in many cases, with some of these stablecoins, it's not just one counterparty risk because you have multiple institutions in there. In that sense, it could actually be great for DeFi because clearly there is a demand for centralized stablecoins, and I don't see why there shouldn't be a demand for a CBDC on a public blockchain. But also, when you think from the perspective of CBDC, of course, you could issue a CBDC on your own ledger, right? You could do that. And it's much more efficient, but then you're not part of the ecosystem. Even if you have bridges, you lose this composability I've shown you, because then there is no way to have it in a single transaction. Then again, you have the counterparty risk. If you would have a CBDC on a public blockchain, then you could use that CBDC in these composable transactions. You could have a single transaction doing all of these different things. And I think that is exciting. In the end, I think it really depends on your definition of DeFi. And this brings me back to my initial statement that this was my definition. But again, when you ask different people, then you might end up with different answers. And I think for today, it's extremely important that we specifically state what we're talking about, that there aren't any misunderstandings, because I think that's the biggest risk, probably. This brings me to the last topic of my presentation, the decentralization spectrum. Certainly there are, and I want to emphasize that, I want to highlight that, there are truly decentralized protocols. And again, this is extremely exciting. So we should keep that in mind. But there are also companies, and in that case, it really is companies, not protocols, that play decentralization theater. And I think the big challenge for policymakers, regulators, and pretty much anyone who has to do with these protocols and companies is to figure out which of these protocols are truly, legitimately decentralized and which of them just play decentralization theater. Let me start with the latter, decentralization theater. And also, again, the stack might be really helpful in that regard. We could start with the settlement layer, let's say. And the first question you could ask, is the blockchain truly decentralized? If the blockchain is not decentralized, when it's just one entity with a consensus-making node on the blockchain, then it doesn't really matter what you're doing on top. You can have a decentralized protocol, but then it really does not matter. Then it's just centralized. On the asset layer, is there off-chain collateral? Is there anyone promising something? Are there blacklisting, expropriation functions, backdoors of any kind? Clearly, when someone has special privileges there, then it's not decentralized. On the protocol layer, is there anyone who has admin keys who can change the protocol? How is the governance token allocation? So when there are some votings, are there any data providers, so-called oracles, with special privileges? Does somebody have a key to a kill switch, for example? These are all things that happen. And obviously, depending on how it's set up, it's not decentralized. And then last but not least, on the application aggregation layer, you could ask the question, who provides the user interface? Who provides the front end? Is there some advertisement, some target advertisement to people who probably should not be in contact with these things? Is it suitable? And so on. So you can really go through the stack again, step by step, and look at all of these different dependencies. But again, and this is really important, there are some protocols that are completely decentralized. So that are completely transparent, that are completely immutable, statically deployed, where you have no operator, where there is no special privilege, and not even the developer, him or herself, can change anything about the protocol. It just keeps running. And even if we would decide that it's a good idea to step in, it doesn't really matter because we simply cannot do so. And that's important to keep in mind. And personally, I think we already have the answers to these types of companies or protocols. That should be pretty obvious because we have financial regulation, and when they are custodians, then we should treat them as such. But that's the much more exciting part right here. So true decentralization. That's what's actually new. And I hope that we can focus on this discussion right here, where something is completely decentralized. And I also hope that we can focus on some of the benefits and not only the risks. Because I think this has a lot of benefits. It's actually extremely exciting. Key takeaways. Number one, DeFi in one form or the other is here to stay. It might change, it might look different. There might be financial institutions involved because there is a place for them, but it's definitely here to stay. It's not going to go away. Number two, the things that probably matter most are composability, self-custody, and the deterministic execution. So that you can look ex ante at a smart contract and you know exactly what is supposed to happen and you can verify that for yourself. Number three, I think there is a place for centralized services in DeFi on top. So it's not that just because you have a decentralized infrastructure, everything needs to be decentralized. On top, you can have financial intermediaries again, you can have more centralized tokens and so on. But what is extremely powerful is that the foundation is decentralized. And I think that's important. If the foundation is already controlled by a single entity, then there is no way back. I think, in fact, it's somewhat dangerous. And number four, when I talk to politicians, policymakers, regulators, government officials of any kind around the world, I usually see that they're extremely afraid of decentralization, that they fear it to some extent. And I think that's not a good approach, to be honest. I think there are many very beneficial properties to decentralization, and personally, I think we should embrace it. Thank you very much.